This is TGP Nominal.
So joining us on the line, I have obviously my regular co-host John Berger and Noah Petro from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, who is a lunar scientist. He's involved with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and he has many hats as well. Noah, tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on today. You know, I do whatever it takes to help disentangle our understanding of the planets in the solar system. So in one version of my job, I'm a project scientist for NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. NASA's had a spacecraft orbiting the moon since 2009. My responsibility is to make sure that we get the observations, that we have the funding from NASA headquarters, that we have the ability to do the research program that we've proposed to do. And so there's the great joy of working with the instrument teams, working with the scientists, and working with NASA headquarters to communicate all of the amazing things that we get to do. At Goddard, I also help manage a research lab of about 30 planetary scientists. And so part of that is making sure that that group has the resources that they need to get the job done. And then independently, I do my own research. I have several colleagues who I work with closely at Goddard, and we are trying to use every available bit of information about the moon, whether it's remote sensing data, compositions from samples, models, to piece together the wonderful geologic history of the moon to kind of unravel its story. So I'm a science manager, I'm a science doer, and a fan of all things lunar. And so that keeps me quite busy during the workday.
Yeah. I can imagine, because the last time we kind of spoke online, you were trying to get your bits and pieces together for basically funding for the next stages of what the LRO is going to be doing.
And we're doing the same thing right now. As a matter of fact, we are right in the midst of the last lap, if you will, in proposing the next 3-year extension of LRO that would take us from September of 2022 through September of 2025. And so we actually are presenting our case in a few weeks, and hopefully we'll hear a good result back from NASA headquarters in a few months that, yep, we got the green light to go ahead, full steam ahead, and continue LRO's continuing mission at the moon.
I'd imagine that LRO is going to be a very important tool to use with the lead up to the Artemis missions.
Absolutely. You know, there's the two halves of LRO right now. There's the data that we've collected from today back to 2009. So we have this incredible archive of data, images, topography, compositions, radiation environment, volatile detections. We have this archive, and there's the data that we collect going forward. And so part of what LRO is going to be doing is providing this data to say, okay, where should we go? What should we ask the crew members to do when they get there? And where should we go that's safe? And then when we have missions on the lunar surface, whether it's a crewed mission or a robotic mission, well, what's the context? What's the environment that they actually landed in? So, if they land on the surface, we can see them, we can see exactly where they landed. We can put down to, better than a meter, exactly where on the moon they are, and understand the context of the samples they collect, the measurements they make on the surface. So there's the support of identifying the landing site, and then the support of, well, what can we do from orbit while we have missions on the surface of the moon, whether it be with humans or robotic missions. And so it's an incredibly exciting time, because we will, in the next year, start having robotic missions, small robotic missions sent by NASA, sent by commercial partners to the lunar surface. And then eventually by 2025, human missions, crewed missions to the surface of the moon as well. And so we're in this very unique position, LRO is, to support that, but also get science out of those experiments as well. I think back to Apollo. I mean, Apollo was this incredible era of lunar exploration, just exploration period. But the orbital missions kind of preceded the Apollo era, Apollo missions. Of course, you had the command module orbiting around, taking data during the landed portion, but then the command module would leave. And so really it was only one mission, Apollo 12. You had Explorer 35 orbiting the moon around the same time. And so there were some coincident observations between the two, but you never were able to kind of pull the levers of both the science advances you make on the surface with contemporaneous observations from orbit. And so we're going to be at this really, I think, important point where we'll be able to do both for a period of time. And I think that's really exciting. And also kind of hopefully a template for future exploration of how we should be doing things going forward.
Well, I know the last time we talked, you said that there's also stuff like, LRO is going to have its own limited amount of fuel and so forth. So you say it's ready to go for 3 more years. How much longer is the LRO expected to be able to go?
So that's a great question. Ultimately, we're getting very creative of how to extend the fuel on LRO. We're in this incredibly hyper fuel efficient mode, and we're looking for ways to eke out and spare every gram of fuel effectively. Right now, our projected out of fuel date is April of 2027. Now, how do we make that projection? Well, we say, well, here's how we've been using fuel recently, so we project that going forward. So if those projections are inaccurate, either too high or too low, of course, that end date will be off. But if we, for instance, we end up using less fuel, of course, that adds the possibility of fuel life on the other end. Now, again, we're using a spacecraft now that's been at the moon since 2009. So any day, something can break. We're fortunate that we know our spacecraft better than just about any other mechanical object in the solar system. So when things have occurred on the spacecraft, we've been able to fix them, of course, remotely. It's like anybody who owns a vintage car. You know all of the tricks to make it work. You know all of the things to just, if you turn the engine on and have the radio on and the wipers on at the same time, it's not going to work. So you do it this way and you get going. So we have, again, we know our spacecraft like the back of our hand. And so we're in a position now where we can operate our spacecraft in as efficient a manner, but also at the same time getting science out of it. If we stop doing science observations, if we stop pointing off nadir direct, we normally are looking straight down, but we'd like to look off to the sides. If we did all of these things, we could extend our life, but we're a science mission. So our heart is spent maximizing the science that we get out of LRO. But eventually we're going to have to start making those sorts of decisions saying, well, okay, if we don't do this observation, that buys us a month on the other end. And maybe that's a trade that we have to make. But for now, our priority is getting the most science out of LRO, and we're still doing it. And it's an exciting time. I'll say it's a little nerve-wracking because we know how precious a resource we have, how important this vintage car is, and so now it's like getting the keys to your grandfather's car. It's classic, and you think, oh boy, I better not mess it up.
So, I mean, you mentioned also that 2022 is quite a good year for the moon in respect because there's a lot of anniversaries and all kinds of things going on. So what have we got coming up? So
in terms of anniversaries, there's 2 big anniversaries this year, in my humble opinion. Well, there's 3 anniversaries. There's the annual anniversary of LRO's launch in June. That's always a tremendous celebration. So this will be our 13th year since launch. LRO becomes a teenager this year. That's a little terrifying. We also are marking the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 16 and 17 missions. It's always nice to mark these anniversaries. There's always a little bit of melancholy saying, well, we mark these anniversaries knowing that this year will be 50 years since humans set foot on the moon. But for me, a little bit of that sadness is twinged with the idea that, hey, in the not too distant future, we're going to be celebrating the 21st century's first human landing on the moon, the Artemis Program sending a crew to the surface of the South Pole. So with those three main anniversaries, we kind of commemorate the science that came out of those Apollo missions, but also it gives us a good example, gives LRO a good example. Say, we learned this from Apollo 16, we learned this from Apollo 17, and here's how that continues to influence the science that we do today. And so that's something that we on the LRO side always look forward to, kind of marking those anniversaries and using it as an example of the kinds of things that we continue to do. We also have in the not too distant future the first of these commercial lunar payload services missions to the moon, small robotic missions that are going to be getting experiments to the surface. And one thing that we're focused on is, okay, again, finding the safe landing sites so that they are successful missions, but then saying, okay, well, those missions are operating on the surface. What do we do in orbit that says, okay, we made this observation of the exosphere of the moon, the atmosphere of the moon at the time that this instrument was making the same measurement on the surface? Are they in agreement with each other? If they are, great. And if not, why? And understanding, again, what all of this is telling us about what's happening at the moon. In a couple months, we're going to be marking the launch of the Artemis 1 mission, which will be the first test of the SLS system and the Orion spacecraft, which will be flying by the moon. And so there's an opportunity for LRO to have some company in lunar orbit, and we're looking forward to some coincident observations with them as well. So from my perspective on LRO, anytime we send anything to the moon, it's a chance for LRO to observe it, perhaps, and to make coincident observations, which really add value to both, our mission and to the other missions, because then we are cross-comparing. Are we getting similar results or not? And if we aren't, we better understand why that is. And sometimes there's really good reasons why that's happening, and sometimes it's befuddling, and we have to really work hard to understand why those differences are occurring.
So would I be right in saying that a lot of the things that we'd learned from the Apollo program will be used quite heavily in getting us to the moon this time?
100%. Now, to be clear, where we're planning on going with Artemis to the South Pole of the moon is a very different environment than the Apollo missions, the near side equatorial region of the moon. With that said, Apollo was trailblazing for us because they showed, one, that it could be done well, and the kind of experiments, measurements, activities on the lunar surface and what you get from them. So for instance, in Apollo, each mission took core samples. They hammered in a tube basically and removed a section up to, by Apollos 15, 16, and 17, 3 meters deep of lunar regolith. I mean, far more than I'm showing here with my hand, of course, but we learned from those measurements, those experiments, that all the myriad of things that you get by those samples. We learned the importance of documenting where the samples come from. You think, okay, maybe that's an obvious thing, but not every mission did it, and every crew documented samples in different ways. So Apollo told us exactly what we think now gets the most science out of that precious time that we're on the lunar surface. On the last almost every Apollo mission collected special samples that were sealed on the surface, that were curated specially, and now over the last 2 years, NASA is running a program that allows for the first time scientists to study some of those previously untouched samples. And so we're actually marking now kind of the next phase of sample return from Apollo by studying a core tube that was collected by Apollo 17 that's been untouched for effectively 50 years. And that, in concert with the planning for Artemis, gives us, again, good insight into, okay, well, here's what we did in Apollo. Did it work the way we thought it did? They sealed these samples on the surface. How well vacuum sealed were they? And how does that influence the design that we're going to try to implement for Artemis sample return as well? So all of the lessons of Apollo feed directly into the planning that we have for Artemis, down to getting the crew members excited about the geology that they're going to be doing on the lunar surface is really important. So it feeds into the training program that astronauts today are experiencing, and that when we get to actually training the crew for Artemis 3, the experience that they're going to have. And so, I'm a huge fan of Apollo history. I consume it almost, as a hobby for sure, but it feeds directly into my knowledge of saying, okay, here's what we did in Apollo. How will this apply to what we're doing now for Artemis? And in almost every case, there's a one for one. This is a lesson, and here's what we're going to be doing differently, or confirming our approach for Artemis.
So, what goes into preserving the samples so that they'll be able to be used like 50 years on?
So yeah, it's a great question. At the time, there was a recognition that the technology available in 1972 or 1971 was at that moment, and that in the future we'd have more advanced capabilities. So part of it is keeping the samples, first of all, dry. The sample lab at the Johnson Space Center, is a clean room, hyper clean. The samples are kept sealed in gas canisters so that there's no interaction with oxygen to do any kind of chemistry to the samples, and kept at a relatively uniform temperature. You don't want these things heating up or getting too cold. There are also samples that were collected that as soon as they were brought to the Johnson Space Center were put in freezers effectively. And so understanding the temperature histories, how these precious samples were curated and cared for. The other thing is just not touching them. That's a very simple thing, is not getting around. There's this really interesting struggle that we go through with samples. And I, to be completely honest, I'm not a sample person. I don't use lunar samples directly. I use the data that comes from them. I ask questions of other people who use them, but I do not physically touch samples. But, this is the great science experiment. The moment you touch a sample, you are effectively changing it. You're contaminating, you're breathing on it. So keeping the samples as removed from the Earth bubble as possible is really important. So that's why most lunar samples are kept in, again, sealed containers, sealed workbenches that are under nitrogen gases, so it's just not interacting with anything else in the Earth's atmosphere. But the moment they take those samples out, they crush them, they cut them, they send them to labs around the world, they're changing slightly. But of course, it's incumbent on us to understand that change, but then get the information out of the sample. You learn nothing by having a moon rock sitting in a display case not being studied. And so there is this struggle of preservation, but then eventually, and this is what's happening now, is saying, okay, let's crack these open and take a look. And what we've learned from the Apollo 17 sample that's being studied now is that they collected this incredible, again, roughly meter or so deep sample of lunar regolith in an incredibly complicated geologic setting. And the little fragments that are in this core are telling us something that we never knew, the dynamics of this landslide that the Apollo 17 crew, I'm jumping around here, but the samples are this amazing window into the history of the moon. And we, for the first time, have this new chapter to read. And so the excitement around these new samples, which have never been studied, and not only not studied, but like literally never looked at. Human eyes have never seen these fragments. Since Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan collected them at Station 3 at Apollo 17 in December 1972, they have been effectively removed from the world, not hidden, but archived, kept in the back of the curation facility. And so now that we actually get to look at it, it's revealing the spectacular diversity of fragments and a really complicated geologic history that we really can only begin to understand. But the benefit, and I'm going on and on because this is so exciting, is that we have 50 years of studying these samples. So today, when we look at this brand new, fresh sample, we bring 50 years of experience so that we know what to look for. The first measurement we're going to make, let's make it as pristine as possible, because we know as more and more we work with it, any gases that are embedded in the fragments are going to be lost. Any volatiles, water that might be in it, are going to be lost. So we now know what to do on day 1. We know what to do on day 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. So we have this experience now of working with the samples that we bring to these, again, this brand new sample from Apollo 17. And that will directly feed into the types of things that we're going to be doing on Artemis.
Wow. And it seems very similar to me. The preservation of the samples is kind of like the flushing that they use in the food industry to keep things preserved. It seems very similar.
Yeah, I mean, you know that you have, well, the assumption at the time, and it holds true, and whether it's for lunar samples or samples that come back from OSIRIS-REx or any other sample return mission, you have these things that have never been in the Earth atmosphere. And so, you want to keep them as isolated from in their little bubble as much as possible. And it's really a challenge. Apollo struggled with this. They, by the time Apollo 17 came back from the moon, they had rock boxes, they had bags. One of the sample bags, the big bag that had rocks in it, was on the floor of the command module when they splashed it down and got water on it. We know the challenges behind getting these things back, and it's a challenge. That's why it's really hard to do this. And so, knowing at every step what we have to do that preservation, whether it's preserving food or lunar samples, you want to keep it in as pristine state as possible, and understand that everything that you do. So when you flash freeze food, what is that doing to the taste, the quality? Well, when we isolate lunar samples in a vacuum and have it come back through splash down, what does that do to core samples? What does that do to the fragments that we've brought back? And understanding every step from the moment it's collected to the moment it's unopened or unsealed or opened at the Johnson Space Center or wherever, what's happened to it. And so that when you get that meal on your dining room table, or you get that fragment of lunar basalt in your research lab, you know exactly what's happened to it every step of the way.
And would I be right in saying that obviously that, as you said, there's probably going to be differences from the samples that you're going to be checking out now to the samples that you've checked out before, because of the time difference and other bits and pieces that have been happening in its makeup?
And sometimes, for some studies, it doesn't matter. If you're just interested in the mineral composition, those minerals haven't changed. But if you're interested in the isotopic composition of gases trapped inside fragments or trapped inside basalts, its history really does matter. Has that fragment, that rock fragment, been studied 16 times? What kind of analyses have been done to those samples? Are there analyses that are destructive or could potentially change the makeup of the sample, or are they non-destructive? Is it just a matter of taking the fragment, putting it on a microscope stage or what have you, and making a very passive measurement of it? And so, one of the things that happens in curation that's really important is first documentation. Okay, here's exactly everything that we've done to every fragment, making sure that its history is recorded, but also understanding that, for any small rock fragment that's been brought back, cut it in half. Half is then preserved, again, not in its pristine state, but kept, and then half is then subdivided and further analyzed and sent out. And so that there's never a whole rock that's just lost. Like, oh, well, we've just studied everything. They've always done a very careful job of making sure that nothing is undoable. That makes sense, is that you could always go back, well, let me study the other fragment from this rock, or let me study some more. Again, and even with very, very, very small fragments of lunar sample, we've been able to do quite a bit. Our ability to study smaller and smaller fragments has evolved incredibly in 50 years. So now you don't need, well, I need this massive rock to do this thing. No, I can just give me, a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter fragment, and I can do a whole host of geochemical analyses. So our ability to use what we have in innovative new ways is really remarkable. Again, I think those folks 50 years ago, the Apollo planners, recognized that the march of technology would go on, and that we'd be able to do bigger and brighter things with the samples. But I can't imagine that they envisioned that we'd be looking for water in lunar samples, and that we'd be as far along as we are. But here we are. The future is a strange and wonderful place.
And I know a lot of the Apollo astronauts weren't geologists. I know there was some that were, but obviously they would have had to have done some kind of geology studies before they actually went into space. Is it going to be, do you think, more forward thinking to have a more diverse crew in that respect that are that kind of scientist, rather than, well, I mean, it's not really going to be, I suppose, yes, they are still going to be test pilots, as it were, but to have scientists in that discipline.
Yes, so every Apollo astronaut, every moonwalker, and really every Apollo astronaut, whether they walk to the moon or not, received some level of geology training. Early in the Apollo program, even the Gemini era astronauts would go out to wonderful field sites to just learn the fundamentals of geology. You know, the simple principles of what, you know, how do we identify samples we want to collect? How do we understand the terrains that we're exploring? All with the idea that eventually some of these astronauts would be going to the moon. Of course, as soon as they got selected for missions, their training evolved and got a little bit more detail. Apollo 11 astronauts, effectively as a crew, had one mission, had one field expedition to go sample and just go through the simple processes of sampling the regolith, the surface. And that was fine. Apollo 11 had to show that you could do it. We did not need to make Neil and Buzz PhD level geologists. They were excellent crew. They brought back incredible samples, but we just needed them to do that job. And every subsequent crew got more and more in-depth geologic training. And as you said, by the time Apollo 17 came around, Jack Schmitt was a geologist, and we sent him to the moon, and he did a spectacular job, and that crew did a spectacular job. For Artemis now, we have the Artemis astronauts, and in that ranks are geologists, physicists, test pilots, and our job remains the same. Is to, you know, I think not that my opinion matters in any of this, but you know what we want these crew members to do is not necessarily. We want them to think like geologists, you know, to attack problems when they get to their site. Okay, you know, we have a plan to collect these types of samples to do these experiments, but this thing I'm observing right now is telling me that I need to deviate that plan. And so we want to train these astronauts to be able to observe their surroundings and come up with a new hypothesis to test at that moment. Jack Schmitt walked on the moon 50 years ago, and he is still replaying that mission and reevaluating hypotheses that he made on the ground and in that subsequent time of 50 years. And ultimately, that's the benefit of sending a geologist to the moon, a scientist to the moon, is that they bring that level of thinking to the moon with them and on the return trip home so that it never leaves them. And so for Artemis, we want to have that same capability that then the moment they land on the surface, listen back to the words that Neil Armstrong says when he walks on the moon. It's almost like a powder. He's describing the regolith because that's what he was trained to do. He's telling the scientists on the ground, this is what it actually looks like up close and personal. We had never seen it up close and personal. Ranger, surveyor, all provided close-up images of the surface, but to actually see it with the human eyes in the human context tells us about the processes that get the surface to the way it is. And so he was making geologic observations the moment he stepped on the surface. And we want the next era of astronauts to do the same thing. Describe to us on the ground what they're seeing and use the information they're gathering in ways that we cannot do on the Earth to inform the types of samples that they collect, the places they're going to sample. And when they go to features that we pick out, go to this crater, go to this rock, go here, 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 and here, that they bring that knowledge with them and aren't just autonomous, you know, human robots. I've been told to collect a sample, so I'm going to do it. They say, well, we thought we wanted to collect this sample here, but there's little fragments of rock here, so I'm going to do that. Or, hey, what's that thing over there? Let's go check that out. We want them to bring that level of curiosity and inquisitiveness to the surface of the moon so that when they bring those samples back, we have work for the next 50 years to do in unraveling the stories that they're telling. That
just seems so mind-blowing, that the fact that these crews that will be going up in just a few years' time, 50 odd years from now, people will be, you know, working with the samples and whatever that they bring back, and that just seems amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, look behind me right now. I've got, you know, albums that were recorded 50 years ago by bands that people are still deconvolving. Their history is great that way. That, you know, you know, people do things. They think, okay, I've done this thing, it's done, but it lives on, and it's our job with Artemis missions or music or whatever it is to preserve it, understand what went into making the selections of what kind of samples that Apollo missions collected, so that we could use that information when we move forward with Artemis. On the other hand, then also knowing that, oh boy, when we're doing Artemis missions, we better record where they are, what they've done. You know, a lot of the work to understand what Apollo did on the surface is saying, okay, they took this picture. We had the TV cameras on the last 3 missions, reconstructing those missions after the fact to understand exactly where specific samples came from and what they were doing. And we can use that knowledge of how important it is in Artemis to say, well, what can we do in Artemis to make that job so that 50 years from now, when someone is studying a sample that was collected by an Artemis crew, even a little bit easier to know its context. And so we never can and we never should forget our place. I won't say in making history. We're not making history. The crew members will make the history. But when they make that history, there is this unintended consequence of scientific. It's an intended consequence, but this consequence that science will live on forever with those samples. You know, Apollo samples will be studied for the rest of time. Artemis samples will be studied for the rest of time. You know, until we have shopping malls and gas stations on the lunar surface and people kind of are, you know, nonchalantly walking around the moon, maybe then that importance will dwindle. But for the time being, when it's really hard and challenging to get to the lunar surface and get samples back to Earth from the lunar surface, those fragments become treasure troves.
So speaking of you said that the previous missions were all more equatorial. So you said this one is going to be more in the southern pole of the moon. Is that specifically because they want to try a different geological area of it? And what part did the LRO have in selecting that area, if any?
So the south pole of the moon was identified as a target for Artemis for one primary reason, and that was resources, volatiles, water. The idea being, if we're going to go back to the moon, let's not go back for 3-day missions over the span of effectively 4 years. Let's go back and let's stay. And let's make this a sustainable presence. And so one of the factors that makes anything sustainable is having resources available, so that you don't have to bring all of the water with you, that you don't have to bring large batteries. And so the South Pole provides 2 valuable resources. One is hydrogen, possibly water, or some version of oxygen and hydrogen mixed together that we could potentially use and harvest into fuel, to go deeper into the solar system for water, for drinking and cooling, and all of the things that we know we need water for. And the second is a little bit of a nuance, but just like on the Earth, where if you go to above the Arctic or Antarctic Circle in summertime, you get, you know, extended daylight or extended darkness, depending on the season. There are places near the pole, both poles of the moon, that get extended illumination. Now, not 100% illumination like the poles of the Earth, but maybe instead of 14.5 days of darkness and 14.5 days of sunlight, you get maybe 80% of a lunar day or a lunar year illuminated. So you have a little bit extra solar power. And so these places become little power stations, basically. And so there are places we know we can go and get resources. And so that's why the South Pole has become this target. It's the old adage about real estate. It's location, location, location. And that's true for the South Pole. Now, the added benefit scientifically is the South Pole is an incredible place. You have the rim of the largest impact crater known on the lunar surface, the South Pole Aitken Basin. You have craters that have never been illuminated by the sun. You have areas that have volatiles. You have areas that have never seen the Earth, that are on, the hemisphere of the moon away from the Earth. So you have this Earth quiet zone. So you have a myriad of scientific checkpoints that we could explore and go and touch. The Artemis mission that lands at the South Pole, and the first Artemis mission, will be landing on a surface older than any terrain we've landed on with humans before. There's a possibility that the rocks that are brought back by the Artemis crews are going to be older than anything that was brought back by Apollo. So that will give us a window into what was not just happening 3 billion years ago or 4 billion years ago, but maybe 4.2 billion years ago, the very earliest history of the moon. And so there's a possibility that, again, just as Apollo rewrote our understanding of the moon and the Earth and the rest of the solar system, that Artemis will add that chapter. There will be that record scratch moment after the first samples are returned from from Artemis, where we say, we thought this for 50 years, but wait, maybe the moon is older, or maybe this complexity factors in. And so, I am so excited for that opportunity to be not proven wrong. Nothing that we've found so far is wrong. It's just incomplete. And so Artemis will help paint a more robust, complete picture of the moon, and by connection of the Earth as well.
So you also said there about sort of like a stepping stones. The moon is going to be a big part of that for moving on to other celestial bodies.
Absolutely. For I think for two main reasons. One, again, the possibility of fuel. Getting into space is challenging. It requires a lot of fuel to get away from the Earth. So if we can get to the moon and get fuel out of the lunar regolith to help propel us deeper into the solar system, all the better, because that will facilitate going to Mars, going deeper into deep space. But second also is ask the question so that when we do go to Mars, Mars is going to be tricky. I'm excited for that, but we can be wrong with our scientific hypotheses, but we can't be wrong with our approach. And Artemis and our exploration of the moon will help hone that. I firmly believe that. And so the moon will be not only a resource stepping stone, but a scientific stepping stone. I don't think that we need to understand every facet of the moon before we go on to Mars, but we need to be smart about the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking on Mars. Simple sample return from Mars from one location will be great, but it has to be driven by a desire to know more about the complete history of Mars. And I think we have to be better educated about the complete history of the moon and how to study the moon and conduct experiments and just operate. Mars is going to be hard because astronauts are going to be largely independent of mission control. The time delay will not allow for questions the crew asks to be effectively immediately answered by support staff on the Earth. They're going to have to operate as really they're on the frontier, and they're going to have to answer and solve their problems, at least immediate problems, without intervention from the Earth. We can practice that on the moon. We can train for that on the moon. We know that if something goes wrong on the moon or near the moon, we can get back relatively quickly. In 3 days. Apollo 13 told us that in even the most dire of circumstances, we can get home. We won't necessarily have the flexibility of having an Apollo 13 style event happen on a Mars mission because of the time involved. Certainly having Houston radio up in real time, how to convert gas canisters to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere, that will be challenging to do in real time. So the crew will have to learn how to work somewhat autonomously. Again, that's not completely without the Earth in the loop, but they're going to almost be on their own. And so we have to be prepared for that as well.
Because that's one of the things that Gene Cernan was saying. He was quite angry about the fact that they were planning to go to Mars without going back to the moon at one stage, and he's like, we need to go back to the moon. We need to have just more than just footprints on the moon if we want to explore further. And it seems that the way he was thinking is what is coming to pass.
I hope so. I mean, all of the Apollo astronauts, I think, feel that way, that we have to. Well, no, I shouldn't say. Some Apollo astronauts feel like we should just go straight to Mars. If we're going to go to Mars, go straight to Mars. And look, it's very self-serving for me. I'm a lunar scientist. I'm a lunar enthusiast. So of course I'm going to say we should go back to the moon. But I really firmly do believe that before you try to summit K2 or Everest, you should kind of make sure you can summit a smaller mountain. And not that the moon is any smaller mountain. There are plenty of challenges in going to the moon. Don't get me wrong. But just as Apollo showed, they did not launch Apollo 11 with the first crewed mission to the moon. They did it stepwise. And I think that stepwise path of exploration, crawl, walk, run, we need to remind ourselves of, okay, let's go back to the moon. Let's figure out exactly how we want things to work, and then give ourselves some more challenges by going on to Mars.
You mentioned before about some of the things that you do is to help the other guys move forward when it comes to the exploration. How in depth would that possibly be for you?
Well, time will tell. We're living that right now, but what we're doing effectively today is saying, okay, here's what we know right now. We have this data. What is the my big phrase for the last 2 years has been, we have to listen to the moon. The moon is telling us everything we need to know about where to go and what to do when we get there. We just have to be smart enough to look and listen to it. And the way we do that is by analyzing the data that we have in hand from LRO and the data that we continue to collect from it. And so one of the jobs that I have accumulated is, okay, here's the best data that we have for the South Pole, for these landing sites that we may be visiting right now. And making sure, we're getting to version control issues, because in real time, we're generating new data, we're adding our insight. And so making sure that the people who need to know, give me the best topographic map of these locations. In some places we have to make it, in some places we have to find it, but we need to make sure that they're using that latest and greatest version of the data. And so part of what I'm doing is trying to make sure that everyone is working off of the same data set. Apollo had the benefit that, there was Earth-based observations, there was robotic observations from Lunar Orbiter, there was Apollo observations from any previous mission, but it was a fairly finite data set. We now have, as I said before, this incredible volume of data from LRO, and just harvesting it, knowing where to look, how to access it, is not trivial. And I have the benefit of having spent many years doing it. So for me, it's, you want an image or multiple images of a particular location on the moon? Give me 20 minutes. I'll get that for you. Whereas someone who's never looked at it, it could take hours, or they would just throw their hands up in frustration. And so data wrangling, for lack of a better word, is one of the more challenging, but I think for me rewarding, because then you get insight into the moon. And like I said before, the moon is telling us everything we need to know. We just have to know what are the limitations of the data. And you cannot get that answer you're asking. How hard is the lunar surface? The picture may not tell you that answer. Hey, but guess what? We have Apollo experience from that. Let's bring to fold not just the data we have from the last 13 years, but from the last 50 or 53 years, and use all of that information together. It would be very easy just to look at LRO data in a bubble, but it exists in this grander bubble that includes everything going back to surveyor and ranger and Earth-based observations as well. And so I think synthesizing all that we know about the moon, from orbital data, from surface data, from models, is something that I think I can bring to bear on helping support our future exploration.
And a lot of the other agencies, I know the Chinese agency have got a rover on the far side, and there's obviously, you hear talk of other plans from other agencies to try and get stuff on the moon as well. Do you think these agencies are going to work together at some point for the science?
So right now, there's this effort NASA is part of, called the Artemis Accords, where we do that. Where we know we can't do what we want to do at the moon alone. Again, I talked about sustainability. We don't. Part of me wants to recreate Apollo, but we don't want this to be 6 missions and we're done. We want this to live on, and one way for it to continue is to have large-scale international buy-in. The International Space Station is a very good example of that. And I think the Artemis Accords, again, this agreement of multiple nations and multiple space agencies to work together towards those common goals, is the only path forward. We have big plans. We want to send humans to Mars. I don't really think we can do that alone. Mm-hmm. But when we bring the talent of the entire globe together to do that, we'll be in a much better position. And while there is competition to get to the moon, competition's healthy. And ultimately, we've learned that multiple countries have now returned samples from the moon: the U.S., Soviet Union, China. And by sharing those samples, by sharing what we've learned from those samples, there's an expression: rising tide floats all boats. Rising science, multi-nation collaboration lifts science. It sounds like kindergarten, but it works the same at the frontier of science as well. When we share, we improve, we learn, and we move forward.
I mean, you look at some of the things that are happening at the moment with things like James Webb, where you've got ESA, you've got the Canadian Space Agency, you've got NASA, all of these universities all working together, and that is what they can produce, and it's amazing. Well, I say
there's an expression.
I don't know yet, but
The promise of amazing is there. There's an expression I was reminded of. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go as a group. We want to go far, and so we have to do that in partnership. There's no way that we. Again, I don't want to disparage Apollo at all. Apollo was effectively a U.S.-led program. We had international collaboration in some of the science experiments, but it was a U.S. program, and we were very successful. And then it ended because priorities changed. But when you go along as a globe, when it's a global effort, that global push can get you further.
That's for sure. Because I went to the National Space Centre here in the UK, and I went loaded with a load of questions from some school kids, and one of the questions was how many countries have a space agency, and I was told that it'd be easier to ask how many countries don't have a space agency.
And I think and let me ask you, why is that? Because no matter where in the world you are, first of all, you can see the moon. You can see space. You can see the wonders of space. It inspires you. So it is a human endeavor. Obviously, I won't say to be successful, you have to have a wealthy nation. Nations all around the globe have contributed to missions. Mm-hmm. And so Artemis has this, first person of color, first woman on the moon. Why? Well, Artemis is a global endeavor, and by having not just buy-in, but support from around the world. And again, Apollo had support from around the world. People everywhere in every corner, except for the 3 countries that did cover Apollo, participated remotely. Well, now we don't want it just to be remote participation. We want it to be intimate participation from around the world, because this is humanity going out there, going to the moon and going beyond. And so when you have students in every corner of the world who firmly believe that they can participate, they can be part of it, and through their home country's space agency or by participating with NASA, that will help it be sustainable as well, because everyone in the globe will be pulling for it and participate.
Now, the last time we kind of spoke, Noah, you were involved with the International Observe the Moon Nights.
That's right.
And you did a fantastic speech on there, and there was a lot of imagery that was provided by LRO on there, and it was fascinating to see, because it was almost 3D in its build-up, and it was mind-blowing to see.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, now International Observe the Moon Night, I think we now just call it Observe the Moon Night. The international is assumed. It's a global event. Again, we talked about the reach of this. No matter where you are, you can be in any corner of the Earth and see the moon and have a connection with the moon. We've had Observe the Moon Night now for, this will be our 13th year, October 1st of 2022. We've had participation on every continent. We have folks in Antarctica who participate. We have folks in almost every country in the world have hosted or participated in International Observe the Moon Night. moon.nasa.gov. You go there, and all of the information you need of how to participate is there. And now we're not just mapping the moon in 3 dimensions. We're mapping the moon in 4 dimensions, incidentally, time, because we can see changes on the lunar surface. And so we now, International Observe the Moon Night is as long as LRO has been at the moon, and now we have time of this program and we have time of LRO, so we can see changes. So our reach, our communication about the moon has evolved in 13 years, just as our science and our understanding of the moon has evolved in 13 years. And Observe the Moon Night, really it's Observe the Moon Day now. I mean, my goodness, this becomes, again, this global event that, again, brings people together to just look at the moon, which is the most important thing. Yeah. I think, the moon is accessible. Last couple nights we had a beautiful full moon, and so I go out and I look and I think, wow, this is beautiful. Oh my goodness. And as the moon and its position in the sky and its appearance, as its phases change, your interaction with it, your experience with it it changes as well. And it's so cool. And you don't need a special telescope. You can just use your naked eye. You can take pictures with your camera phone. You can take pictures with the most advanced telescopes in the world, or you can send missions to the moon. At the end of the day, you're looking at an object that has been a partner with the Earth for over 4 billion years, is effectively, I call it the 8th continent of the Earth. It's an extension of us. And, it's a place that we have been with humans and we're going back to with humans. And it's beautiful.
Certainly is. And that is the beauty of it, is the fact that anyone, anywhere, at any one time, can see it at the same time, near enough. I mean, obviously, depending on what hemisphere you're on, but that is the beauty of it, and that's what makes observe the moon night so simple to grasp.
It is not a very complicated, again, you don't need special tools. You don't need to be in a special position. Okay. It's not like watching a solar eclipse, special glasses, path. Go out and look at the moon. If it's clear, go out. If it's cloudy that night, go out the next night. And every night after that, I always encourage people to look at the moon every opportunity they have and build a relationship with the moon, not just once, but over days, weeks, months, and then years. And then it becomes a lifetime passion of, okay, where is the moon? Okay. Yeah. And then being able to say, okay, tonight the moon is going to be here. Maybe you set a reminder on your phone. Maybe you look, but cognizantly always having the moon part of your experience, whether it's your daily routine, your weekly routine. To me, it's comforting. I look for the moon in the sky. It's there. Great. Phew, I have a job. But then it just, but then it's a reminder that, okay, I'm looking at it, and people all over the hemisphere, and effectively, like you said, all over the world, have the same experience. It is a shared experience, and it's wonderful.
So looking beyond LRO, because we talked earlier that it's, well, like any spacecraft, it's going to run out of fuel and so forth. Is there a replacement for LRO in the works, or what are they going to do with that?
That's a great question. So, actually just a few days ago here now, there was a meeting of scientists to define that. What do we want to do going forward? What does the next lunar orbiting mission look like? Now, there are other lunar orbiting missions coming, shorter-lived missions, Lunar Trailblazer, Ice Cube, Ice Mapper, CubeSats. So it's not that we haven't planned for, well, what's the next science that we want to do at the moon? But I think the question then becomes, do we really want to do bigger, longer-lived missions? LRO has shown that if you stay at the moon for a long time, you learn more than just a 1 or 2 year mission. And so the science community has to make that case of, well, what do you get? It can't just be, well, we'll just send a mission there and figure it out. What is the science justification for a long-lived mission? I believe LRO has made that justification, and so we're defining it. So there are other orbiting missions that are being planned to be sent to the moon, not necessarily replacing LRO, but adding. We've been there for 13 years. The science of what we want to understand on the moon has evolved, and so the kinds of questions, the kinds of instruments we want to send has changed as well. And so one of the things that we need to define is, what does that next generation lunar orbiting mission look like? Is it a huge, larger than LRO mission? Is it multiple small missions? And again, depending on the science case you want to make and do, the type of mission you send there is going to change. LRO was sent to the moon. We had Laddie, we had Grail, we had L-Cross, of course, as well. But we're the only mission that was in this. Well, I'm sorry. Grail was in a polar orbit as well. What kind of orbit do you need to have? Do you need to get high resolution imaging? Does it need to be a low orbit? All of those knobs you can twist and turn to define your mission. And so now it's on us. It's on the science community to define, well, what does this next era of lunar orbital exploration look like? And a number of my colleagues, friends, have been thinking about it for a number of years. So again, there's no guarantee, but we have to make that justification. Headquarters will not just say, oh, of course, here's the next mission, you get to go do this. We have to come up with the scientific rationale for what it will look like, and why we need it, why the data we have right now doesn't answer everything. And of course, that's easy. We know the uncertainties. We know what we don't know. Just a matter of packaging it in a digestible and achievable manner.
And with the technology that we have now compared to when the LRO was originally launched, there can be some incredible science done.
Absolutely. I mean, sensors have evolved in the 15 years since the LRO payloads, or even more than that, since the payloads were defined. But the types of science, okay, what can we do for understanding the exosphere? We sent the LADEE mission to the moon, and it was an equatorial orbit, and it helped understand the exosphere of the moon. But we know the poles are this unique environment, so let's send a mission that again investigates the polar environment remotely as well. Again, following on to the myriad of discoveries that we've made with LRO. So it's a matter of again, yes, the instrumentation has improved, the questions have improved, and our understanding, while it has evolved, we're still confused about things, and so we have lots of questions. We're never going to run out of questions. It's just a matter of again implementing a mission that's achievable, that answers those questions, and raises others as well.
Awesome. Now, Noah, you've been on the show now. This will be your third time coming on TGP Nominal, and if you were talking in the scope of soccer, that would be a hat trick, which means you would have kept the game ball. But so we would like to make you, if you would like, to be one of our honorary crew members.
I would be honored. I don't get asked to join other teams very often, so I would be delighted to participate. And let me thank you. Talking about space and communicating to the world as you do what we're doing, our hopes, our dreams, our ambitions for space and space exploration is really important. And that's another part that makes this era somewhat different than the Apollo era. Is yes, you could turn on the TV and see Patrick Moore and see James Burke or see Walter Cronkite and get excited about it. But that only happened during the missions. James Burke went off and did a great job of communicating. Patrick Moore went off, did a great job communicating. Carl Sagan has done that. But you fill this gap in making it a conversation. It doesn't just happen once, shot, special, miniseries, boom, boom, boom. It's going on all the time. And so I would be honored to join your august crew of merry pranksters.
So what we do is we would send you one of our mission patches, like I've got here. And all I ask in return is when you receive it, if you could take a photograph of yourself on it so that we can put you on our honorary crew member wall.
No. Hold on. You're forgetting something, Mark.
Yes, I know.
I am maybe a 90-minute drive from Goddard Space Center. I think it would be much more, I think it would have much more of an impact for me to deliver that patch personally.
I think we can arrange that. That would be. I think that's a date. Let's just say that.
All right.
I think we can make that happen. And again, like over the last 2 years, our occupation of Goddard has evolved, and we're slowly ramping up on-site presence. So the Goddard of the future will be a little different than the Goddard of the past. But the stuff is still there. The labs are still working. The things that we're building are still happening. We're still developing hardware. And so, part of my future excitement of returning to Goddard is to see what this brave new insight in-person working environment is, but also then to share that with you, John, or with anyone else, because it's our agency. It's not a place I work. It's all of ours. And I would love to do that.
Sounds good. It is a date. In fact, I can't remember exactly where it was, but I actually interviewed for one of the contracting companies for NASA outside of Baltimore like 15 years ago for an IT job that they had. And it was, I can't remember, it dealt more with the space station than anything else, I believe. So I don't think it was actually Goddard, but I do remember being out there and interviewing with them, which was very cool to think of.
I pinch myself all the time. I'll be honest. Every day I'm like, that's right, I get to do this. That's pretty cool. That's great. No, I'd love to do it. I'd love to have you and show you around, reintroduce myself to Goddard, and become a member of your crew. That would be.
Well, are you not at Goddard though? What do you mean reintroduce yourself?
I'm in my I'm at Goddard. I'm in my basement. I've been in my basement for 2 years now.
Oh, fair.
So I'm at Goddard.
Same here.
So I'm at Goddard. I'm not at Goddard every day anymore. So I need to remind myself where the coffee shops are, and all of the hidden gems of our fair space.
It doesn't even have to be a Goddard. Just being able to hand it to you would be cool enough.
We'll get it to Goddard. It's all right. The future is looking bright.
Okay, sounds good.
Because for me, chatting with someone like you is amazing, because when I was a kid, NASA was something that wasn't approachable, especially being on this side of the pond. But now, I never would have thought that I would be talking with somebody who works at NASA about the different projects that are going on out there. It's mind-blowing for me. When I was a kid, there was two things I wanted to do in life. One was either be an astronaut. Through health issues, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The other was to get into broadcasting. So doing what I do, or doing what we do here, is part of a dream, really.
Well, and NASA, again, I tell students this all the time. NASA is astronauts and scientists and engineers and artists and financiers and computer scientists and graphic designers and writers and managers and so for students kids or adults who love NASA, the tentacles of NASA are many and are widely distributed. And there's internships for students, there's opportunities to get involved. And so it's not just rocket scientists and astronauts. It's geologists and chemists and biologists and all of the other things that I listed that make what NASA does so special, because it is a big tent to do all the things that we want to do. And it requires the workforce that we have, the excellent workforce that we have, to get it all done.
And it's very true. And the fact that for me, since I've been podcasting, the space family, as I call it, has been so accommodating. It's an amazing family out there, and that's everybody. I mean, that's all the different agencies and the companies, private companies, and the academics and everything else that goes along with it. Just really want to talk about it. They really do.
Because it's the greatest job in the world. It really is. Or not even in the world, in the universe. It's the greatest. I mean, it really is this incredible thing. I never thought I'd get to work for NASA as a kid. And here I am. So it's, dreams come true. You just have to be tenacious and a little stubborn sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Noah, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on board.
Pleasure's all mine.
This morning. But hopefully we can catch up again. I mean, obviously you're going to be catching up with John in the near future. But yeah, you are always welcome to come on board TGP Nominal.
Mm-hmm. Just raise the flag and I'll be here. I enjoy it, and thank you. And again, thank you for all you do. It's an honor.